Just waiting a few more minutes for people to join. Everyone, welcome to the webinar on humanitarian energy insights presenting recent humanitarian assessments. My name is Elif Güldemir from the Global Platform for Action on Sustainable Energy Displacement Settings, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. So this webinar is the second part of a webinar series organized by Mercyco and Energy for Impact and supported by the GPA Coordination Unit. The series aims to present the findings from the assessments conducted by Mercyco and Energy for Impact back in June 2022 in 4 countries. And last Thursday, we've heard about Uganda and Rwanda assessments, and today's webinar will focus on assessment findings from Somalia and Niger. So just to give you an idea of what the GPA is, we are a global initiative aiming to improve energy access in displacement settings for communities such as refugees, internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and their host communities. And we work towards this goal at global level, operational, and field/country level by focusing on 5 working areas such as coordination, innovative finance, data, policy, and advocacy, and capacity building. If you want to know more about the humanitarian energy and the GPA, you can visit our website, which will be posted on the chat right now. And similar to the previous webinar, we'll have a short introduction from Cecilia Ragazzi from Mercyco about the study and the objectives of the study, and then we'll hear about the findings from the Somalia assessments from Rebecca Gunning from Energy for Impact, which will be followed by a short intervention from Fasika Diro at IOM Somalia. Then we will move on to learning about Niger's study findings from Rebecca, and then we'll hear from Rebecca Soles at WFP Niger. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. And like the previous webinar, we've booked 1.5 hours for this. So if you have the time and interest, you can stay on until 4:30 p.m. CET for more informal discussion. And make sure to use the chat for your comments or questions to the presenters, and we will get back to them during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Cecilia from Mercyco to kick the webinar off. Cecilia, over to you.
Thanks, Elif. Hello, everybody. My name is Cecilia Ragazzi, and I'm a Mercyco and Energy for Impact Director for Energy Access. So my personal passion lies on the intersection between social inclusion through renewable energy and humanitarian contexts. Therefore, when Mercyco started speaking with Shell a few years ago on how to leverage our respective strengths, we quickly aligned on the vision of bringing sustainable and affordable clean energy to refugee settings. Mercyco experiences firsthand and daily the impact of lack of clean energy solutions in the lives of displaced communities. This could be for cooking, for social and educational outcomes, and also in income generating opportunities. On the other hand, of course, Shell has the know-how, technical and commercial expertise to contribute to the solutions of this problem. From our constructive dialogue, Enter Energy was born to develop sustainable mechanisms to deliver energy access to displaced and hosting communities. In Ethiopia, we jointly brought to life the first interaction of Enter Energy that aims to deploy, operate, and maintain clean, affordable, and viable energy infrastructure for lighting and powering and supporting business opportunity in and around the displacement settings in the Somali region of Ethiopia. However, our vision enlarged with our proof of concept, and together we decided to assess the energy needs of displaced communities in 4 additional countries: Uganda and Rwanda that you saw last week, and Somalia and Niger that we are discussing this week. At Mercy Corps, we also benefited from the accrued technical capacity from our Energy for Impact colleagues, with whom we merged about 1 year ago. The goal of these assessments is to understand the current and projected need for energy access, spanning from lighting, powering, productive uses, and also clean cooking. The presentation today focuses on Somalia and Niger, and we walk through the key elements of the regulatory framework, the stakeholder scanning that also includes other relevant interventions in these countries around humanitarian energy, and the key figures related to current income levels, current and aspirational uses of energy, and all these with their related prioritization incomes. I now pass it over to Rebecca, who was the lead researcher on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this webinar. I know that it's a very busy time in December, so really appreciate that you're here to hear about our findings. So as Cecilia and Elif have said, I'm going to focus on the research findings from our work in Somalia and Niger. I'm going to start with Somalia. Next slide, please. So first, I'd just like to give an idea of the sort of methodology that we followed for the research. So we carried out some desk research, and in addition to that, we did household, business and institution surveys at various sites, carried out focus group discussions, had key informant interviews, and then in Somalia, we had an online workshop with 15 companies working in the energy space. IDPs in Somalia are spread throughout the country, and with kind of limited time and resources, we had to be able to focus on a number of sites to be able to do the study. So in discussions with Mercy Corps and looking at the current situation, what data was available, where things might be similar in 2 different sites, we finally selected 3 cities to look at. Baidoa, which has a high IDP population, 475,000 at the time. So we carried out this work between February and May, and so the data refers to that period, and I think particularly for like the number of IDPs has gone up since then. So at that time it was around 475,000 IDPs in Baidoa compared to a host population of about 130,000. Galkayo had around 125,000 IDPs compared to the host population of about half that, 61, and Kismayo 66,000, and there the host population is larger, in fact 234. We carried out the work with a local consultancy called RDI, who are based in Mogadishu, and we also had support from Sean Brooks from Tethered Up. Next slide, please. Just to put a little bit of context on it, just to give you an overview of Somalia, it's a country with a population of about 16.8 million, and 80% of that population are under the age of 36. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. Per capita gross domestic product about $420, and it's rated at the bottom of the World Bank's Ease of Doing Index, primarily because of the lack of the legal regulatory frameworks, the threat of Al-Shabaab, and also challenges in terms of getting money in and out of the country, and there's no protection on intellectual property. Those are just a snapshot. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Oh, no, sorry. And then, so within that, then the humanitarian context, the UNHCR has had at that time 3.1 million people of concern in the country, and of those, almost 3 million are internally displaced. And the primary reasons for displacement are conflict and insecurity issues and climate-related shocks, primarily drought. And the ongoing drought is creating more of a problem now as more and more people move towards the cities and these IDP sites. It's generally a protracted situation, and these IDPs don't expect to return home. As I mentioned, IDPs are distributed across the country, and there are 2,400 sites. So it's different from how you might envisage in other countries with refugee camps. These can be very small sites with up to, say, 20 households camping on vacant land or in empty buildings, very much with makeshift housing and tents, through to much more managed sites where there might be thousands of households. So there very much varies across the country. And lots of these sites are really overcrowded with poor conditions. And one of the other things is, because of the way that it's settled, that most IDPs have no land tenure, and therefore they're at risk of eviction. So that's over half of the IDPs are actually at risk of eviction at any one time. So the situation is poor for many IDPs. Next slide, please. But there are national policies to protect these people of concern, particularly from further forced displacement, provide them with protection and access to health in some areas, access to education in other areas. It's not the same across the country. And there's also, as part of the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees, there's a national durable solutions strategy, which looks at trying to find durable solutions for the IDPs. As part of that, one of the things that's happening is that some IDPs who are at risk of eviction are being relocated to new managed sites that are planned with social infrastructure. So this picture shows an example of one in Bawaka, which is outside Baidoa. And about 40,000 IDPs have been relocated so far, not just here, but across the country. But that's ongoing, and there are further sites planned. Next slide, please. The energy market is, electricity access is low in the country. It's only around 36%, much higher in urban areas than in the rural areas. But generally, it's an unregulated power market. And most of the electricity is provided in urban areas by privately, locally owned run mini-grids. That's estimated about 90%, and the private firms are known as ESPs, or electricity service providers. But because they're all individual and it's not very efficient, and using imported fuel, electricity prices in Somalia are some of the highest in the world, between 50 cents and $1.5 per kilowatt hour. Although there are authorities responsible for energy, there's no real clear policy or regulation or enforcement of anything that there is. So in theory, ESPs are supposed to get a license to operate, but that doesn't mean that all of them do. There are also plans looking at trying to make a more integrated system within the country, but realistically, in the foreseeable future, the local mini-grids are going to be the main reality going forwards, although it may change further into the future. Somalia has good wind and solar resources, and actually there's a growing demand. So many of these diesel grids are hybridizing with solar. Beko, the ESP that provides Mogadishu, now has 9 megawatts of PV. Nescom in Garo has 3.5 megawatts of PV plus 450 kilowatt wind. So it's happening. And then there are a number of small solar mini grids that have been developed as well, which is sort of 100 kilowatt, that's or smaller size. There's no quality control, and there's no import tariffs vary across the country, and there's no duty free is applied. There's no I don't know what the word is. There's no reduction in them, and also there has been quite a lot of donations and give outs from humanitarian organizations, which has also distorted the market. So there are a number of challenges in terms of the solar market in particular. Within the IDP communities, the energy programming is focused on donations again of products for healthcare, water pumping, schools, also solar street lighting, and donations of solar lanterns. And then a couple of solar mini grids have also been developed for IDPs. Next slide, please. So different types of stakeholders need to be involved for delivery of any sustainable energy solutions. And at the core of that, of course, is the displaced and host communities need to be at the core of what goes forward for any sort of energy initiatives. In Somalia, there are more than 270 humanitarian actors working on everything from basic needs. But there is a strong emphasis on self-reliance for IDPs, and therefore there's quite a strong emphasis on the livelihood programming and relocation and urban planning that I mentioned before. So some of the partners, but as I say, there are so many, they're obviously not all mentioned here. The World Food Programme also has a strong role in food and cash distribution, and also working on clean cooking. And in terms of the government, as I mentioned, there is organisations responsible for the policy, but also at the local government, they are key potential partners, such as the municipalities in the local areas who have a keen interest in energy. And then there are also organisations involved with the IDPs. So there's the energy on the IDP side. In terms of donors, the World Bank is a key stakeholder in the energy sector and has two main projects, the Somali Electricity Access Project and also the Somali Electricity Recovery Project, which is looking at hybridization with solar, battery storage systems, and adding more standalone systems, and the potential more capacity building and the potential for doing some sort of linkages in the future. Others working in the sector, Alight, NIS and NDEV have all looked at solar systems for IDP. CEDA has been doing work on training, as has GIZ. FAO, UNDP, UNEP have been working on charcoal reduction and therefore clean cooking. So there's quite a lot of various bodies working in the energy sector, but not necessarily focused on IDPs. The finance sector, again, is likely would need to be involved in anything going forward due to the higher cost versus the incomes of people involved. And then the private sector in Somalia is flourishing, and there are lots of providers of products. More generally, there are fewer providers of the quality energy products, but they do exist. The ESPs could be interested in extending to IDP areas, but they feel that they would want support because at the moment it doesn't feel like it's a market for them. And then one interesting project is Cube Energy are financing and building a 2 megawatt solar project in Baidoa to supply power to the UN's support office in Somalia with the Southwest government. And they've done that as well with a World Bank Niger guarantee, and they're hoping to secure peace renewable energy certificates from energy peace partners. So that just gives you a kind of flavour of the actors involved. Next slide, please. So now going to the actual results of the survey. IDP incomes are low, and most of them rely on casual and day labour in the 3 sites. It varies slightly what sort of labour that is, whether it's construction or agricultural processing or farming, but it's mostly casual day labour. Host community are more likely to be self-employed. Most of these IDPs have been there for between 1 and 20 years, we found, but most of them, particularly in Baidoa, are recent arrivals. They have low access to electricity and lighting, so most of the households relied on either battery torches or mobile phone torches, although there was some mini-grids where mini-grids might have extended slightly to an IDP area. There was some use of solar lanterns and some solar home systems. And notably in Galkayo, 44% of the interviewees had no lighting. In comparison, the majority of the host households that we interviewed had access to a mini-grid, but these were expensive. In terms of cooking, IDPs relied primarily on firewood, where the host communities seem to use charcoal more. And most of the IDPs used a 3-stone fire or traditional stove. For costs, the lighting costs varied, but were around $1.50 to $3 a month, depending on what they were using. But that would be for the mobile phone or a battery torch. And mini-grid electricity also varied, but it was around $10 in Galkayo and $15 to $16 a month in Kismayo and Baidoa. For fuel wood, they were paying, it varied again between kind of $8 and $10 per month in Kismayo, and it was much higher in Galkayo. Energy for businesses, most of the businesses that were interviewed were actually in the host community areas, so often were connected to the mini grids, whereas those within the camps just used the same mobile phone torches, and some had solar home systems. And similarly, institutions tended to be not within the IDP area, and so were connected to mini grids or had solar systems. Next slide, please. So this just gives you some of the data that I've just gone through. So the incomes were estimated at sort of between $100 and $120 per month per household, and expenditure there on lighting and mobiles between the 3 and 4, and cooking fuels then 9 to 12 in Kismayo and Baidoa, and about 30 in Galkayo. And actually many more households in Kismayo and Baidoa went to collect fuel wood compared to in Galkayo. But the biggest expenditure for all households was food. And it was also interesting that some of the answers meant that there were figures on expenditure were much lower than earnings, and yet there aren't any savings. So I think some of the earnings might have been overestimated. Next slide, please. So this shows you again the main source of lighting, that how many had no lighting at all, cooking with firewood. And yeah, 41 to 43% of households collected firewood in Baidoa and Kismayo, whereas in Galkayo it was more like 24%. LPG was used, but it was never as a primary fuel. Next slide, please. Then looking at the kind of ecosystem for if you were looking at setting up energy interventions in any of these sites. The security situation is quite variable, but it can be poor, and it's a difficult business environment in many places to work within. Mobile phone ownership was almost universal, and mobile money usage was very high at 89% or more in some places. There was experience of informal credit mostly through local shops and some through VLSAs, but very limited experience with formal financing. And the banks that were interviewed said that they also weren't that interested. They kind of might be interested, but they also found working with IDPs too risky. Similarly, with the products, suppliers of quality solar products, none of them have presence in the IDP camps, and they feel that they would need additional support to support them to be able to sell products within this community. And there's been a level of free distribution at all the sites, which undermines the ability to maybe set up some sort of market-based system. There are cheap, low-quality solar products available in the market, and there's a kind of low awareness among people who are interviewed of what was possible with a good quality energy system, what they would be able to do, if they would be able to have any income generation from it, what they could really do. Similar to the quality solar providers, ESPs might be interested in going into the IDP areas, but would feel like they'd need support to extend their lines there. Transport, again, networks vary across the country, and that is a consideration if you're going more inland and further from the ports. And in terms of investment, much investment is actually concentrated on Mogadishu, but it's obviously happening everywhere. And one of the models in Somalia is where IDP, but relatives in particular, invest in projects, and that's something where there's a potential for that across the country. And next slide, please. So this just gives some of the figures to those points, and this is this is an amalgamation of the host community and the IDP community interviewed. Next slide, please. In terms of how energy fits with government and community priorities, the government's national priority is to increase energy access, so it's very much in line with that. And although there isn't much policy at the national level, the local government is very supportive and would help push that. The policy of the durable solutions and setting up new camps provides an opportunity for long-term plans for energy. In terms of the community's priorities, they were less about energy and more on clean water, because there's an issue with water in many places, particularly with salination, healthcare, education, as opposed to energy. When asked if they wanted better energy, they said yes, but then when they were given a list of community priorities, then energy wasn't necessarily the highest, although where they did put any priority on energy is street lighting, household lighting, and cooking. The number of people willing to pay for the service was much lower than those who wanted better service. And when asked in some of the focus group discussions as well about having installment payments, that was something that was of interest, but actually when then asked if it was on a credit agreement, they were not interested in having credit, because if they took credit, they wanted the credit for food rather than for energy. And another point on the alignments is that there is definitely potential for aligning with the livelihood program, which is very strong across the country. So those are sort of possibilities for alignment and priorities. Next slide, please. So that's just there, highlights some of the key priorities. And again, here, the percentage of community that would like clean cooking and community, this is the numbers when it was against all of these other priorities, as opposed to when they were asked if they wanted something better, then the numbers were higher. So next slide, please. So looking at all of that data, there's definitely opportunities clearly for improved energy, but also for sort of market-based systems for improving energy across households, businesses, and also for clean water as priorities. And the high cost of energy and the low level creates great opportunities. There are options potentially for mini grids and for standalone systems, depending on the actual location and setup of the individual IDP camps. But one of the key things is that because it's unregulated, you have to be aware of what's happening, what the other actors are happening, not treading on other people's toes necessarily, and negotiating and discussing with all the potential partners to ensure success. Because of the low income levels and the ability to afford it, then installment payments, it might be a possibility, but maybe combining that with the livelihood or financial inclusion as options. It's also likely that subsidies are still needed to an extent to bridge that affordability gap. And if you want some of the existing energy businesses to help to support the IDPs, then they're going to need some sort of support to help them overcome their perception of risk. And there's an option for credit products, which again is not strong for the energy products at the moment. And because there's a real lack of awareness of what's possible with energy projects, there's also something that could be done coupled with awareness raising and demand stimulation for energy appliances. So I think that brings me to the end. Thank you for Somalia. Pass you back to Elif.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing the analysis of the results from the Somalia assessments. Now I would like to invite Fasika Diro, who is the site planner for IOM Somalia, to share a few words. Fasika, over to you. Rebecca, do you have confirmation that Fasika will be able to join?
Yes, that's confirmed. Let me just check.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah, I think he might be at the wrong link. He said he's been in the meeting, but there's nobody there.
Oh, okay.
I'll just send him the updated link. How weird.
Interesting. Might mean that he is in the first webinar, maybe? I'm not sure.
Maybe. Let's hope.
In the meantime, everyone, please feel free to put your questions on the chat. We will make sure to address them in the Q&A session after the presentations are done. So, let's see.
Can't tell if they've read the email. I don't know, maybe we come back to Fasika when we finish Niger as well. And have,
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Maybe you can look out for him.
Yeah.
Arriving.
I'll be keeping my eye on the participant list. So then, Rebecca, back to you for the findings from the Niger assessments then.
Okay, great, thank you. So yes, so similar to Somalia, the timescale for Niger was the same for the research. So we're data collecting between about February and May. Again, for a bit of context, population of Niger is 24 million, and most people live right along the south, where it's a bit more hospitable. 75% of labour is involved in agriculture, but Niger ranks last in UNDP's Human Development Index, meaning that it's more than 90% of the population is in multidimensional poverty, which refers to everything from housing, water, education, etc. But in terms of the World Bank's ease of doing business, it's at 132, but there are definitely still challenges on access to credit, regulation, difficulties with licenses and title deeds, and corruption. Next slide, please. So the methodology was similar to that I described for Somalia. And in Niger, refugees and IDPs are located in a number of sites along the south of the country. And again, we had to look to just focus on a few of these sites. And so again, in discussion with Mercy Corps and looking at what data was available and the various security situation, we selected 3 sites. And these were Abala in the west in Tilbury, which has around 16,000 refugees. And there's also an IDP site there. And then also 2 sites in Maradi, Chadakori and Dandaji Macau, which they've all got the sort of red ring around them here. And in Niger, we worked with a local consultant, Bello Nassaru, who helped very much with the local Mercy Corps office on the data collection in the country. Next slide, please. So Niger hosts around 580,000 persons of concern. Of these, almost half are IDPs and about 43% are refugees. and most are young. The majority of the refugees come from Nigeria to the south, and followed by Mali from the west. And the primary reason is conflict and insecurity, both for the IDPs as well as in neighboring countries, and climate-related shock, primarily drought. Niger also has supportive policies for refugees, where refugees have freedom of movement, they're entitled to work and provided with shelter, and they have access to water and education. And in terms of electricity and power, they have the same access as nationals to electricity grid or mini grids. There's no additional requirements, which there is in some countries, but not in Niger. In some ways, they're treated like Niger citizens. However, there are very few opportunities for income generation for the refugees. And in fact, although they have entitlement to work, they have to get an additional permit to be able to do that. And they often lack skills and access to finance to be able to access any of these economic opportunities. And it's part of the government's approach for social inclusion of displaced communities, and in line with the Global Compact. They have also setting up more permanent sites. So in Abala in the west, they're building more permanent site on the same site where they're building cement houses to relocate the refugees into. And Abala is majority Malian refugees. And then in Maradi, they've relocated families from the border area where there are higher security issues further within the country to villages of opportunity, where again they're building a sort of social infrastructure and permanent cement housing. So the photos here show the housing in Chadakori, where the refugees hadn't moved into it yet at the bottom, but they're currently still in the tents at the top. Next slide, please. In the energy market, Niger has one of the lowest electrification rates in sub-Saharan Africa. It's only 12.3%, or was 2 years ago. In urban areas, clearly higher, and almost nothing in rural areas. 80% of those connections are on grid, and the grid kind of goes along the bottom, the south of the country. And then the remaining are off grid. There are plans and a strategy for reaching 80% electrification by 2035, and they want to reach 65% electrification by 2030. And that's broken down by expansion and densification of the existing grid, mini grids and standalone systems. The main utility is Nigelec, who runs the grid and has a 10-kilometer monopoly on any energy access, any electricity access from the existing grid. But they're also the developer of diesel mini grids, which are scattered around the country. And in addition, there are a number of PV mini grids that have been installed quite recently. And some of the diesel mini grids, which are clearly expensive to run, are being hybridized with solar, some of the Nigelec ones. And there are plans to extend the grid as part of the National Strategy for Electricity Access, and with support from the World Bank, are looking at extending the grid and linking up some of the existing mini grids. In terms of building new mini grids, that's quite supportive. The policy is quite supportive that they can own and operate mini grids, and you can set your own cost reflective tariff, except that it has to be still approved by the Rural Energy Agency. And there are still some uncertainties that make it a bit more of a challenge for private sector to invest in mini grids related to structures and ownership, and what happens if the grid does get closer. For off-grid solar market, it's still fairly nascent, and it's been largely donor and government led. Not completely, but largely. The kind of market approach is still quite small. There's been a project that has been looking at extending it, and there are 3 pico solar companies that are now using pay-go services, for instance, and there are 2 of the mobile operators are working with them on pay-go options, and 2 banks and 1 microfinance institution are also all now looking at solar products, but none of them have really got much traction in the market yet. Certified solar products are exempt from import duty, but it's still quite challenging for private companies to make a business with the PICO and the quality products. Mobile money is nascent and incomes are very low. Enterprise financing is high. In parallel to this, the clean cooking sector is also not very well developed, with the majority of people still reliant on biomass cooking. Next slide, please. As with Somalia, a whole number of different stakeholders need to be involved for the delivery of the sustainable energy solutions. And again, the displaced and host community need to be at the centre of those solutions. The humanitarian sector is not quite as large as it is in Somalia, but UNHCR here is a key partner, in particular this protection mandate and coordinating. And then one of the other key actors is APBE, which is a national NGO that has the mandate from UNHCR on camp management and coordination of partners in most areas, not every. The World Food Programme also is strong focus on food and cash distribution, and is also doing some work on clean cooking, and we'll hear a bit about that from Rebecca a bit later. And then, as well as the humanitarian sector working on basic needs and cash assistance for refugees, there's also quite a lot of livelihood and some financial inclusion programming where it might be possible to work with energy access. Any energy programming that's happened within the settlements at the moment has been donor-based, and in one, except for 2 main exceptions. One was a EU-funded project run by UNHCR and APBE, and one is a current Mercy Corps project called Al-Hiri. Both these projects looking at private sector-led LPG market. One was doing it in Diffa and one now in Maradi. In terms of government stakeholders, there are those responsible for the refugees and IDPs, but then those on the energy side, there's the regulator and the main agency on energy access and the Ministry of Energy. Donors, the World Bank is again one of the key stakeholders in the energy sector, and they have a large project called Haske, which is looking at supporting grid extension, densification, putting solar power into the existing diesel mini grids and linking up some of them, plus off-grid solar electrification. And importantly, as part of that, they've earmarked $60 million just for energy in displacement areas. And as part of that, they're looking at, for instance, linking the Abala mini grid to the main grid. Is also on the cards as part of that work. Other donors in the energy space include African Development Bank, Abu Dhabi Fund, EU, USAID, but there are others. Again, for finance, if looking at some sort of financing as part of the energy intervention, they need to be included, and there are at least two banks and 1 MFI already working with energy products, but there's scope for more. And then on the private sector, there are suppliers of quality certified solar products, but they tend to be in the main cities and they're not out in the refugee areas. And as mentioned in Somalia, they might be interested in going to those areas if they got support to do so, to overcome the risks of going there. Next slide, please. Then looking at what the income energy looks like in the 3 areas. Refugee incomes are really low, really low. So household incomes varied between 33 and 63 US dollars a month between the 3 locations. And notably, the refugees in Maradi had much higher reliance on cash assistance and remittances, whereas in Abala, the highest reliance was on casual day labour. But that's casual day labour is otherwise the other main thing, and that could be in agricultural processing, construction, some farming. The biggest expenditure for all the households, it was food, which was I think between 60 and 80% of total expenditure, followed by energy, and then in some places some water, but in many cases water was free, but not in all. For energy, there was low access to electricity. With the lighting source for refugees was either dry cell battery torches or mobile phone torches. The mobile phone torches, they were higher in Abala, where mobile phone ownership was generally higher than in the two sites in Maradi. Daji Macau noticeably had more solar lanterns, and that's where they had been distributed. And there are policies to distribute solar lanterns to almost all refugees, or to give them shelter, which includes a light. But actually, in our surveys, we didn't see any evidence of that in the ones that we interviewed. And when some host community members were asked about their solar lanterns, they bought them from refugees. And similarly, with some LPG stoves had been bought from refugees who had obviously been handed them. In comparison to the refugees, relying on that, the host communities in Abala, there's a mini grid where some host community are connected, but it doesn't have that many connections. Similarly, in Chadakori, the national grid is present, but with not that many connections. But the national grid was about 8 kilometers away from Dandaji Macau. The cost of lighting was between $1.50 and $2 a month, and mobile charging was sometimes included with that if it was the mobile phone, or in addition for $1 to $2 a month. The cooking was in Abala was based on wood fuels, which were collected from quite far away, so the majority of people bought them. And in Maradi, they relied on millet stalks, where more people were collecting the millet stalks from the roundabout fields. And where people were purchasing wood or stalks, it was about $8 to $10 a month. Next slide, please. There weren't very many businesses within the refugee camps, and most services were offered from the host communities, which were really quite close in each case. And therefore, the energy was supplied by a mini grid, diesel gensets, or some solar. There were shops within some of the refugee, and there was some milling here, which was just done with diesel, as you can see in the picture. Social institutions, again, depended on their location. If they were in the host community, they tended to be connected to whatever grid was available. But if they were in the refugee site, then they tended to have diesel gensets and or solar systems. Humanitarian agencies weren't based in the camps, they were based in the host communities, so again, similar. And as I already mentioned, there's been interventions on free distributions, plus solar street lights, solar water pumping. But the exception to that is the LPG programming that I mentioned. And the other key point that I already made actually was the World Bank's Haske project is looking to electrify refugee areas. Next slide, please. So this just gives you some of the stats from that previous slide. And as in Somalia, the percentage of households that want more energy or the lighting or cooking was very high because they're not satisfied with their existing solutions. Next slide, please. And again, here's the lighting that they have. Access to grid, you can see, is higher. There is some in the host community. And charcoal is hardly used at all. Okay, next slide, please. So again, what does the ecosystem look like within these refugee sites? And sorry, I didn't mention at the beginning that, as you saw in the initial statistics, there are almost half of the displaced people are IDPs, but we were actually focusing on refugees. So although we interviewed some IDPs, we surveyed some IDPs in Abala, which is next to the refugee camps, next to an IDP camp. Our focus actually was on the refugees in this case. So the population density, particularly in these areas where they're building the new cement houses, is very similar in each site. And many of the camps will look to extend. So there's sort of similarities between them, but there's a real opportunity to be able to help develop with the productive uses and create income opportunities with the use of energy and entrepreneurs. The security situation is variable in the sites that we were looking at. It's fairly good, but if you went closer to the borders, then it becomes more insecure. But the areas that we were looking at is relatively good. And in all of the conversations that we had, it was reported that there were good relationships between the displaced populations of host communities. There are these donated products that have been sold and stopped working, which kind of undermines anything going forward. And the solar companies are not nearby. The ones with the certified products, they're far away in the big cities. There's, similar to Somalia, there's a very low level of awareness of what potential energy products are and what they can do, and how a quality product might compare to the products they see in the local market. So there's definitely quite a lot of market awareness would need to be done, and on what the possibilities are. There's very limited experience with any form of finance. So there was some financing on formal finance or informal finance, but mainly in the host communities, and very little in the refugee communities, although some NGOs are trying to establish savings groups. Mobile phone ownership high in Abala and so in Maradi, but mobile money access was incredibly low, less than 3%. But mobile money operates in the host communities, but it's just not popular yet. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here you can see access to mobile money. When asked about it, the responses were, "Oh, I don't have enough money to use it," or "I don't understand it," or in Maradi, they didn't have phones in some cases. So there were a number of reasons for it.
I don't like people behaving. I'm not the
Next
kid.
slide,
You're
please.
helping me, I'm helping you. Why are you now
Sorry,
trying to act like
Abiodun, can you mute yourself, please?
I'm so sorry.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Then on aligning with government, donor, community priorities, there's quite a lot of good alignment with how energy access could align with it. The National Energy Policy wants to increase energy access, which includes for refugees. There's alignment with the extension plans and the World Bank's projects as HASKE, and the World Bank has another project called NESAP, which is looking at off-grid solar systems, and it's under that the finance organizations have become involved in solar products. But in terms of what the community's priorities were put when they've given a longer list, then energy wasn't top of their list. Then they're looking at healthcare, clean water, particularly in Abala, and finance for business and improved housing were prioritized over energy. But energy is still there as a priority. Because there's very little experience of kind of market-based energy systems, or particularly with solar systems, there would have to be quite a lot of awareness on that and kind of developing a market-based initiative to make it happen. With the exception, as I said, with the Mercy Corps and the SEED project, it was in DIFA. There's definite livelihood programming everywhere, and there's a potential to build on that and to build on the income generation at the same time as energy access. It looks like there is work going on in financial inclusion, but it was more limited in terms of finding synergies with energy, but that might be something as well that could be worked upon. Next slide, please. So that again just summarizes some of those points. And then next slide. Oops, sorry, and next slide. Doesn't come out, I think. So what opportunities are there? Again, everywhere could benefit from improved energy access for households, for businesses, and for the institutions. And in many cases, small-scale solar appears the most viable in locations that are not going to be covered by grid extension. But some of these actual locations that we were looking at might be covered by grid extension. And there's real opportunities for income generation everywhere in parallel with the livelihood programming. There's a potential for models to allow installment payments to make it a bit more affordable, but it's probably likely that subsidies will still be needed because there's a big affordability gap. In the focus group discussions, even being shown the kind of lowest cost but quality solar lantern, very few thought that they could afford it at that price. They felt that they would need subsidy and installment payments even to get the smallest of the products that they were shown. Where the grid extension will occur, there's scope to support access to energy appliances and productive use of energy to really support the income generation and have an impact on the refugees' lives. And again, it's that awareness raising is required because there was very low awareness about what energy could do and what products were available. So anything would have to have some sort of parallel awareness rising and demand stimulation in parallel. And I think that probably sort of summarizes the potential kind of avenues for getting solar energy access, improving energy access for the refugees. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for the detailed presentation, Rebecca. And now I'd like to invite Rebecca Solis from WFP Niger to share about their energy interventions and activities there. Over to you, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see me and you can hear me. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to organizers and to Rebecca for inviting me to say a few words about the work that we're doing in Niger. My name is Rebecca Solis. I'm a NORCAP energy expert deployed to World Food Programme in Niger, in Niamey. I work as an energy for food security advisor for the WFP's energy program for beneficiaries, for end users. So the program is called Energy for Food Security. Maybe we can have the first slide. As I was saying, the program is called Energy for Food Security, and it aims essentially to implement energy access interventions with the aim of strengthening standard WFP programs focusing on food assistance and rural development and resilience building. So we do this by implementing projects on clean cooking as well as various energy services to support the development of local food value chains. So pretty much, as I was saying, looking at cooking, irrigation, food transformation, food preservation, some of the services that Rebecca was now mentioning for the case of Niger. Maybe also to mention a second principle of this, of WFP's energy program is definitely this approach where we are trying to focus a lot on the sustainability of projects by promoting as much as possible market approaches as part of our project design approach. So in Niger, I think you can see in the slide, in Niger, the energy project is pretty much focusing at the level of strategy development on the basis of the thematic scope that I just mentioned for energy, as well as the type of delivery model approaches. We have written a country energy plan that is looking basically to integrate energy access interventions within 5 of WFP's strategic objectives in Niger, which essentially revolve around providing emergency response school feeding program, nutrition assistance, rural development, and capacity strengthening. So the justification for taking this approach in Niger country office in WFP, focusing on strategy development, as opposed to directly testing individual project level concepts, is that in Niger, WFP has been, for the past years, conducting several energy access and clean energy initiatives, mainly focusing on irrigation for smallholder farmers and schools, mechanization for food transformation initiatives, improved clay stoves for households and schools. And so the country office took the decision to go for a more coordinated approach and sort of try to reflect and see how we can address more systematically key issues of project design, financial viability, and end user adoption, which are some of the key issues that we have identified in Niger and in the analysis that we've been conducting now. So as you can see from this slide, for a number of months, we've been conducting different steps to elaborate this plan. We've done an analysis at different levels, and most notably of the country strategic plan of World Food Programme in Niger. We've been looking at past and ongoing energy interventions, as I was mentioning, conducting internal consultations with our program colleagues across areas of emergencies, school feeding, nutrition, etc. And we also conducted initially a scoping and user assessment, as well as a short market analysis, more of a short market mapping in collaboration with our colleagues in the regional office. So maybe next slide, please. Thank you. So the framework that we have proposed is at different levels, but I would like to just focus on the end user solution. And here, actually, what we can see is just a summary of different initiatives that have been conducted in Niger, and sort of a bit of a summary of long-lasting project level challenges. So pretty much the identification of issues such as a long-lasting focus on technology as a premise for designing projects. We also see that we have a very strong technical expertise, but we still need to reinforce more of the end user and human-centric design approaches when we are looking at the full program cycle. We have also identified that for most projects, we had very limited existing data on the actual impact of projects. So these, of course, had its sort of came with the limitations for how we could identify existing issues related to past and also how that could impact the design of future projects. And the number 4 is in terms of how limited and short-term funding streams really need to be factored in how we design energy program design. As I said, financial viability was one of the issues that we have identified when it comes to rethinking scalability of projects. And then the last one is in terms of the actual program cohesion. So we do have, as I mentioned, a number of energy projects, but as of now, we pretty much have identified that they are conducted in a more of a siloed approach. So I would like to move now to the next slide. And so the framework that we propose, as I began to say, is at different layers, but I would like to focus more on the end user solution level, just to be a bit more sort of concrete also in these few minutes. So here we propose 3 broad scenarios that are in line with WFP's approach and programs, and as I mentioned, the country strategic plan. And when we did this identification of the linkages of energy within the current country strategic plan. So just as you can see, they are pretty much focusing at household, school, and smallholder farmer level. And this is also in line with the thematic scope of cooking and essentially the full food system, no? So from cooking to agricultural production, and then the post-harvest energy services. So as next steps, we are conducting a country energy assessment, and we're doing this to validate these scenarios in a way that allows us to specify concrete solutions per region. And so the aim of this assessment is to now not only validate specific solutions, but also to inform the next country strategic plan of Niger. So what we want to do is to sort of say how we can mainstream energy into the design of the official results framework. So we have selected 4 regions: Tillaberi, Tawa, Difa, and Maradi, because WP has interventions focusing on emergencies and rural development and resilience, and also including, of course, school feeding and nutrition interventions. And then in terms of just briefly the research scope, it's a quantitative analysis at household level. So pretty much looking at what are the energy needs within the household, cooking, lighting, and productive uses for both subsistence and commercial type of needs for looking at both crop production and livestock rearing. There's also a second exercise that we call the area-based approach, which is focusing more on a qualitative type of assessment, looking at selected infrastructures and community services. So as I said, through qualitative research methods, so focusing on health centers, virtual centers that are dedicating to treating malnutrition, schools. We're also speaking with local suppliers. And so with this, we are looking at energy needs from a more of a perspective of looking not at individual, but at community centers. So as you can see, the scope of the assessment is quite comprehensive. And just as a last line, just to mention that we are really trying to identify what are the energy needs that are sort of matching the full local food value chain, in line with WFP's thematic scope. And I think I will stop there. Maybe I can take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really interesting to hear from the country level and how you're looking at this from different areas in terms of households, schools, and smallholder farmers. And now we can move on to answering your questions. I see one from Alban. What looks like the most efficient in terms of energy supply, focusing on solar home systems, or microgrid to your mind, considering authorizations, but also system perennity? Maybe just for clarification, is this for Somalia or Niger, or maybe both? Rebecca, or to you? Both, okay. Thanks, Alba.
Okay. For me, I think it depends exactly what you're looking at in terms of a group of households and whether you go for the microgrid or the solar home systems. But I think it's kind of horses for courses, that it depends exactly on the situation that you're looking at in particular. And what experience there is there, what technology is already being used. So in some places, a microgrid might make more sense where there's some experience with something similar, but otherwise the solar home system, if it's more off the shelf, might make more sense. But I haven't got a firm answer for you. I don't know whether anyone else would like to respond to that too.
Yeah, I think it also depends on how the households are dispersed in 2 different countries, I think, because you mentioned that in Somalia there were many small sites with relatively small communities, whereas in Niger, I think we have more like settled places for people. So maybe it might make more sense for them to have solar home systems in Somalia for certain settlements, but maybe a microgrid, because it already exists, might make more sense in Niger. So it really depends on the context I'm assuming. Yeah. And I think for Somalia, we've talked about like limited regulatory framework and limited experience with formal finance for IDPs, and lack of like presence of private companies in the camps, and how we need more support for extending these services to ID camps. So are there any reflections from your side in terms of how it compares to Niger, where we see some private sector presence?
I think the one of the main differences, is that the private sector is really flourishing in Somalia, despite, or maybe because of the lack of regulation, depending which way you look at it. But that the IDP communities are still seen as quite high risk for those companies to enter. And that's where the similarity is, because actually the private sector is not nearly so strong in Niger. There are fewer companies operating, and the market is generally also smaller. So it is more difficult. So it's possible that in Niger, you might need even more support because the incomes are even lower, and the population areas are smaller than they are in Somalia, where there's quite large populations in each of the areas we're looking at. Even if the individual sites might only have up to 20 households, there'll be another one quite close by. So the markets are potentially there. But so the kind of low income levels are the same across them, but they were lower in our studies in Niger than they were in Somalia, and the private sector just wasn't there to the same extent.
And what would you see in terms of steps that can be taken in both countries in terms of increasing the financial inclusion of displaced communities?
I think financial inclusion is not my expertise, but so in both places they're working on financial inclusion. So there is some work in financial inclusion in Niger, particularly setting up savings groups. So I think there would be something you could do with the energy on piggybacking on that, and of course, or using the examples that there are in other countries that by introducing the solar system on some sort of a credit deal, that you then build up the credit rating for those customers. So I guess that is a way also that you could do it in parallel. So that's possible. And I think that is also a possibility in Somalia in terms of building up the credit, because the formal finance doesn't exist there. There's a lot of kind of borrowing from shops on credit for the next food meal, but not more the formal or even kind of formal informal credit.
Right. I think we've focused a bit more on the electricity side of things. And if we look at the cooking side, do you see any commercially relevant opportunities to address? Or if not, would you recommend a blended model more with like private or public capital? How do you see it going forward in terms of improving clean cooking in both countries?
In Niger, I would think a blended model it would work. And I mean, there you've got an example of a market-led intervention actually working, where they've done it in Diffa in the east of the country, and there was donor funding for the kits for the households and some subsidy towards the initial payments of gas, and then that was enough of an incentive them to work with the private sector for them to then support setting up the infrastructure to be able to supply that gas. And since the funding finished, they've been, even although not everyone kept it, the numbers are still quite high, and further people have bought gas since then. And then a similar model is being carried out in Maradi. So I think that works, and that is a blended model, and could be rolled out further, I think, potentially in the other site of Bala. In Somalia, I think when we asked about LPG, there wasn't a great appetite for it actually, but there's definitely scope. So one of the Kenyan stoves, the burn stove, they are in one area in Somalia, and there could be models where you help existing suppliers, not necessarily them, maybe some homegrown Somali ones, where they can prove that they've got up to a certain level, that you then help them go into IDP areas. And I think, again, it would have to be a blended approach to really reach them, and maybe you could introduce some finance with that as well.
And are there any questions for Rebecca from WFP Niger? Please feel free to type them on the chat, or I will keep asking questions that I have on my head. Okay, we have from Joseph on the chat. I'm just going to read it out loud. From what I've heard about Somalia and Niger, the foundational elements for commercial energy access services do not exist. Hence, it seems the only practical way to move forward in accelerating energy access to IDPs is via global NGOs or other development organizations such as WFP, with access to funding in order to implement some pilot projects. As to pilot projects, it would seem that community solar projects providing lower cost community energy services like solar microgrids, mini-grid recharging batteries that are rented at very low cost to households in the community would be an optimal solutions. Opening this up to comments from attendees as well. And Rebecca or Cecilia, if you have any reflections on this, please feel free to share.
I can start, Rebecca.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for the question, Joseph. Actually, I would beg to disagree with you. I think that some of our experience at Mercy Corps and Energy for Impact actually demonstrated that there's a possibility to have some commercial energy solutions also in displacement settings. So the premise is indeed that this series of assessments was really like to try to adapt and replicate the inter-energy model that we developed for Ethiopia. The basic idea is that displaced communities are already indeed paying for energy access services. It might that be around clean cooking, as Rebecca pointed out, or even lighting and powering. So there's definitely an interest from displaced communities to have access to better quality products. Because again, like they're already indeed paying for some quality services and pieces of equipment. So I think that our financial model that we demonstrated in Ethiopia was actually quite relevant in trying to develop additional models that could function also in these other for countries. Now, I think that the level of maturity of the different markets, it's of course different, as Rebecca showed us today and Laura last week. And again, like I think that there's still the need for a good measure of a blended financing in humanitarian energy context. But I also think that there are some specific instances where financial viability has been demonstrated. And I think that, of course, like as for everything, when we get to the scaling point, of course, like we would have also like better financial outlooks for financial systems in general. I hope that this answers your question. And of course, Rebecca, if you want to compliment, feel free.
No, I think you covered it. That actually, that's exactly right. That there is potential for commercial solutions. It might be that they need a little bit of support to establish, but there's the potential for them to then be sustainable beyond that support.
There's one more question on the chat about your findings in food security and energy in Somalia. Mary is saying that climate resilience, agriculture and energy, as Somalia's agricultural production drastically decreased for the last 15 years due to climate change. So maybe you can talk about how it affected the food security in the region and specifically in displacement settings we see in Somalia.
Hi, Mayor Watton. Thank you for your question. In terms of the study that we did, we didn't cover food security. It was evident, though, in the surveys that food security was an issue within the IDP communities, and that many IDPs had been in agriculture previously, and now that they've moved to cities such as Baidoa, they weren't able to practice agriculture, and agricultural production had decreased, but it wasn't something that we studied, so I don't think I can speak about it. But one of the elements that I think the energy could really feed into is on to do with water and solar water and potentially desalination. So there's definitely potential on the nexus between the food security and energy, but it's not something that we looked at for this.
If I can add, Elif.
Yes, of course.
At Mercy Corps in Somalia, but also really like across the world, we are increasingly complementing climate smart agricultural techniques with clean energy technologies as well. So definitely not specifically for this assessment, as Rebecca mentioned, but definitely at Mercy Corps at large, we're really looking at this nexus, because as you say, definitely the food security situation in Somalia and across the world is tragic. At the same time, though, you still need energy, both to produce more food and also to cook that food, of course, like with also a food security outcome as well.
And here, maybe it will be interesting to hear from the WFP side in Niger in terms of their findings or like initial ideas in terms of how to improve food security in the country. Rebecca? Are you still with us? I think she is. Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments to our presenters? If not, I think we can close the webinar. So big thanks to our speakers, Cecilia, Rebecca, for sharing their knowledge and activities to improve energy access in displacement contexts from their respective organizations. And I would also like to thank you as the participants for taking the time to join and sharing your insights and questions with us. I know it's a very busy time in the year, so I really appreciate it. I would also like to thank Sadiq, who is the technical support behind the organization of this webinar. And Cecilia, Rebecca, if you have anything to add here, please feel free to do so.
No, just thank you very much for attending. And yes, this afternoon when it's busy, thank you.
Thank you also for facilitating, Elif and the GPA. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And you can find the recording and presentation from today's webinar at the GPA website, also posted on the chat. I hope this has been an interesting one for you. Thank you once again for your time, and we wish you a great day. Thank you.